Chapter 20 from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. The third flight of Beelzebub to the planet Earth. After a brief pause, Beelzebub continued. This time I stayed at home on the planet Mars for a very short while, only long enough to see and talk with those who had just arrived, and to give certain instructions of a common tribal character. Once these obligations were taken care of, I descended again to your planet with the intention of pursuing my aim. That is, to uproot from those strange, three-centered beings their horrible custom, which they considered a sacred duty, of destroying the existence of beings of other brain systems. On my third descent to the planet Earth, our ship Occasion did not alight on the Clydius Sea, now called the Caspian, but on the sea known at that period as the Sea of Beneficence. We decided to alight there because this time I wished to go to the capital of the beings of the second group on the continent of Ashhark, the city of Gob, which was situated on the southeastern shore of that sea. The city of Gob was then a large city and was renowned over the whole planet for its production of fine fabrics and what are called precious ornaments. The city spread over both banks of the mouth of a large river, called the Karyachi, which rose in the eastern highlands of the country and emptied into the Sea of Beneficence. On its western side, another large river called the Naryachi flowed into the same sea, and it was chiefly in the valley of these two rivers that the beings of the second group on the continent of Ashhark existed. If you like, my dear boy, I will tell you a little about the history of these beings, Beelzebub said to Hassien. Yes, grandfather, please. I shall listen to it all with great interest and gratitude, replied his grandson. So Beelzebub began. A long, long time before the period of my present tale, and even long before the second great catastrophe to that ill-fated planet, while the continent of Atlantis was still at the height of its splendor, one of the ordinary three-centered beings of that continent discovered, as later became clear through my investigations, that the powdered horn of a being of a particular exterior form, then called Pirmaro, was a very effective remedy for all sorts of diseases. And this discovery was afterwards circulated far and wide by various freaks on your planet. At the same time, there was gradually crystallized in the reason of ordinary beings a directing factor, of course illusory, which later contributed to the formation in the common presence of each of your favorites, especially the contemporary ones, the reason of their so-called waking existence. And this factor is to a large extent the cause of the frequent change in their convictions. Owing to this factor, crystallized in the presence of the three-brained beings of that period, it became the custom that anyone who fell ill, as they say, of some disease or other, had to be given a dose of this powdered horn to swallow. You might be interested to know that Pirmarals still breed on your planet, but the contemporary beings take them merely for one of the species they call deer, and have no special name for them. Well, my boy, the beings of the continent of Atlantis destroyed so many of these Pirmarals for the sake of their horns that soon not a single one was left there. Then certain beings of that continent who had made a profession of hunting Pirmarals went to look for them on other continents and islands. This kind of hunting presented great difficulties, for it took many hunters to round up and capture the Pirmarals. So these professional hunters always took their whole families along with them to help. One day, several of these families banded together and set off to hunt Pirmarals on a distant continent, then called Iranan, which later, after the upheavals caused by the second catastrophe, was called the continent of Ashhark, and today is known by your favorites as Asia. For my further tales concerning these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, it will be useful for you, I think, if I emphasize here that because of various disturbances during the second terrestrial catastrophe, certain parts of the continent of Iranan entered within the planet, while in their place other land masses emerged and attached themselves to it, with the result that this continent was considerably changed, becoming almost as large as the continent of Atlantis before the catastrophe. Well, my boy, one day while this group of hunters and their families were pursuing a herd of these purmarls, they came to the shores of the water space later called the Sea of Beneficence. This sea, with its rich and fertile shores, pleased them so greatly that they no longer wished to return to the continent of Atlantis, and from then on they remained in that region. At that time this country was indeed so marvelous, and so subtenenalian for ordinary being existence that no being in his right mind could help liking it. Not only did great herds of the two-brained beings called purmarls exist there, but the shores of this water space, situated in the middle of that country, were covered with luxuriant vegetation, including vast numbers of fruit trees of many kinds, whose fruit then still served your favorites as the principal product for their first being food. And there were also such multitudes of the one-brained and two-brained beings called birds, that when flocks of them passed overhead, the sky became, as your favorites say, quite dark. The waters of the Sea of Beneficence so abounded with fish that you could almost catch them with your bare hands. As for the soil along the shores of the sea and in the valleys of the two great rivers flowing into it, every inch was so fertile that it could be used to grow anything you like. In short, the country and its climate so delighted the hunters and their families that none of them had any desire to return to the continent of Atlantis. So they settled there and multiplied, soon adapting themselves to the surrounding conditions, and existing, as is said, on a bed of roses. At this place in my tale, I must tell you about an extraordinary coincidence that had important consequences both for the first settlers of this second group and for their descendants down to recent times. It seems that when the hunters from the continent of Atlantis decided to settle by the Sea of Beneficence, there already existed on the shores of that sea a being from their own continent who was very important at that time and who was an astrosauveur, that is, a member of a section of a learned society, the like of which has never again appeared on the planet Earth and probably never will. This learned society was called the Society of Aclydons. The circumstances that had brought this member of the Society of Aclydons to the shores of the Sea of Beneficence were as follows. Just before the second catastrophe, those genuinely learned beings then existing on the continent of Atlantis, who had founded that truly great society, became aware that something very serious was about to happen on their planet. So they set themselves to observe very carefully all the natural phenomena on their continent, but in spite of all their efforts, they could not find out precisely what was impending. Somewhat later, they sent certain of their members to other continents and islands, in the hope that by their combined observations they might learn what the anticipated danger was. These members were to observe not only natural processes on the planet Earth, but also every kind of celestial phenomenon. One of these members, the important being I just mentioned, chose the continent of Iranan for his observations, and, having migrated there with his servants, settled on the shores of that water space later called the Sea of Beneficence. One day, this learned member of the Aclydons chanced to meet some of the hunters on the shores of this sea, and, learning that they too had come from Atlantis, he was naturally very glad and began to establish friendly relations with them. Thus, shortly afterward, when the continent of Atlantis was engulfed within the planet, this learned Aclydon, having no longer a place to return to, remained with the hunters in that future Maro Plessis. Later, the group of hunters chose this learned being as the most intelligent, to be their chief, Still later, this member of the great society of Akaldans married one of the hunter's daughters, named Rimala, thus becoming the founder of the second group on the continent of Ashark, or as it is now called, Asia. A long time passed. In this country, generations of three-brained beings arose and disappeared, and, as everywhere else on the earth, the general level of the psyche of this group underwent many changes, sometimes, of course, for the better, sometimes for the worse. As their numbers grew, these beings gradually spread more and more widely over the country, though always preferring the shores of the Sea of Beneficence and the valleys of the true great rivers that emptied into it. Only much later, a common center of existence was formed on the southeastern shore of the sea, and this city, named the City of Gob, became the chief place of residence for the head of this second group of beings, whom they called a king. This position of king became hereditary, beginning with the first chief they had chosen, the learned member of the Society of Akaldans. At the time to which my present tale refers, the king of the beings of this second group was the grandson of the great-grandson of that learned being. His name was Konnichin. My later inquiry and investigation showed that this King Konnichin had introduced a most wise and beneficial measure in order to uproot a terrifying evil that had arisen among the beings who by the will of fate had become his subjects. And he introduced this measure in the following circumstances. One day, King Konnichin observed that the beings of his community were becoming less and less capable of work, while scandals, robberies, and acts of violence were on the increase among them, as well as many other unpleasant incidents, which had never occurred before, or only in quite exceptional cases. These facts surprised and grieved the king, who became very thoughtful and resolved to get to the root of this sorry state of affairs. After lengthy observation, he finally came to the conclusion that the cause lay in a new habit of the beings of his community, namely the habit of chewing the seeds of a plant, then called Gulgulian. This surplanetary formation still arises on the planet Earth today, and those of your favorites who consider themselves well-educated call it papaveroon, but the ordinary beings simply call it poppy. As I have just said, the beings of Maralplessis had a passion at that time for chewing the seeds of this surplanetary formation, which had to be gathered only when ripe. In the course of further observation and impartial reflection, the king realized that these seeds contained a certain something, which, when introduced into these beings, had the power to change them completely, for the time being, all the established habits of their psyche, so that they saw, understood, sensed, and acted quite otherwise than they were accustomed to do. For instance, a crow would appear to them to be a peacock, a trough of water, a sea, a harsh clatter, music. Goodwill appeared to them as enmity, insults as love, and so on and so forth. As soon as King Konnichin became thoroughly convinced of all this, he dispatched some of his closest and most trustworthy subjects throughout the land to issue strict orders in his name, forbidding all beings of his community to chew these poppy seeds. He also arranged that those who disobeyed his orders should be punished and fined. At first, thanks to these measures, the use of these seeds appeared to diminish in the country of Maralplessis. Very soon, however, it was discovered that this was not so. In reality, the number of those who chewed the seeds was even greater than before. On realizing this, the wise King Konnichin decided to punish still more severely those who persisted in this habit. At the same time, he increased the surveillance over his subjects and enforced punishment with even greater strictness. He himself began going about everywhere in the city of Gob, personally examining the guilty and meting out punishments, both corporal and moral. In spite of all this, the desired result was not obtained. The number of those who chewed poppy seeds rose steadily in the city of Gob, and reports from other territories subject to him showed a daily increase. It then became evident that many three-brained beings who had never before indulged in this habit now took it up merely out of curiosity. One of the particularities of the psyche of the three-brained beings of that planet which has taken your fancy, that is, merely to try out the effect of those seeds whose use had been prohibited by the king and punished with such relentless severity. I must emphasize here that although this curiosity had begun to be crystallized in the psyche of your favorites, immediately after the loss of Atlantis, it never functioned so blatantly in the beings of former epochs as it does in the contemporary three-brained beings there, who have more of it, I dare say, than there are hairs on a tusuk. So, my boy, when the wise King Konnichin finally became convinced that he could not root out the passion of chewing Gulgulian seeds through fear of punishment, and saw that the only result of his measures had been the death of some of those punished, he repealed all the orders he had previously issued, and once again began to think seriously about how to find a really effective means of destroying this evil, so lamentable for his community. As I learned much later, thanks to an ancient surviving monument, the great King Konnichin then retired to his chamber, and for 18 days neither ate nor drank, but only very seriously thought and thought. According to my most recent investigations, the king was particularly anxious to find some means of uprooting this evil because by that time all the affairs of his community were going from bad to worse. The beings were addicted to this passion. The beings who were addicted to this passion had almost ceased to work. The flow of revenue into the communal treasury had entirely dried up, and ruin stared the country in the face. Finally, the wise king decided to deal with this evil indirectly, by playing upon the weaknesses in the psyche of his subjects. With this aim, he invented a most original religious doctrine corresponding to the psyche of the beings of that time, and he propagated this invention of his, by every means at his disposal. In this religious doctrine it was held, among other things, that far from the continent of Ashhark lay a large island on which there existed our Mr. God. You must know that in those days, not one of the ordinary beings was aware of the existence of any cosmic concentrations other than their own planet Earth. They were certain that the scarcely visible white points far away in space were nothing more than the pattern on the veil of the world, that is to say, of their planet. For in their notions, the whole world consisted, as I have just said, of their planet alone. They also believed that this veil was supported like a canopy on special pillars, the bases of which rested on their planet. Well, it was asserted in that ingenious doctrine of the astute King Konnichin that Mr. God had intentionally attached to our souls the organs and limbs we now have, in order to protect us against our environment and enable us to serve him effectively and profitably, and not him alone, but also the souls already taken to that island of his. When we die and our soul is liberated from all these specially attached parts, it becomes what in reality it should be, and is immediately taken to this island where, in accordance with how it has existed, with its organs and limbs on our continent of Ashhark, our Mr. God assigns to it an appropriate place for its further existence. If the soul has fulfilled its duties honestly and conscientiously, Mr. God leaves it to continue its existence on his island. But the soul that here on the continent of Ashhark has been idle or discharged its duties indolently or negligently, existing only for the gratification of the desires of its attached parts, or finally has not kept his commandments, such a soul our Mr. God sends to a smaller neighboring island for its further existence. Here on the continent of Ashhark exist many spirits attendant upon him, who walk among us wearing caps of invisibility, thanks to which they can constantly watch us unnoticed and report all our doings to Mr. God, or inform him on the day of judgment. We can conceal nothing from them, neither our actions nor our thoughts. This doctrine also said that our continent of Ashark and all the other continents and islands of the world were created by our Mr. God only to serve him and the meritorious souls already dwelling on his island. All the continents and islands of the world are, as it were, places of preparation and storehouses for everything needed for this island of his. This island where Mr. God himself exists with the meritorious souls is called paradise, and existence there is just roses, roses. All its rivers are of milk, and their banks of honey. No one there needs to toil or labor. Everything necessary for a happy, carefree, and blissful existence is to be found there, supplied in superabundance from our own continent and the other continents and islands of the world. This island of paradise is full of young and lovely women from all the peoples and races of the world, and any one of them belongs for the asking to the soul that desires her. In certain public squares of that superb island are great heaps of jewels, from the most brilliant diamonds to the deepest turquoises, and every soul can take anything he likes without the least hindrance. In other public squares of that beatific island are piled huge mountains of sweet meats prepared with essence of poppy and hemp, and every soul may help himself to as much as he pleases at any hour of the day or night. There are no diseases there, and of course none of those lice or fleas that give us all no peace here and blight our whole existence. The other smaller island, where for the rest of their existence our Mr. God sends the souls whose temporary physical parts have been lazy here and have not existed according to his commandments, is called Hell. All the rivers on this island are of burning pitch. The whole atmosphere stinks like a skunk at bay. Swarms of horrible beings blow. Police whistles in every square. And all the carpets, chairs, and beds are made of fine needles with their points sticking out. One very salty biscuit is given to each soul once a day, and there is not a single drop of drinking water on the island. There are also innumerable other torments that the beings of the earth would not wish to undergo for anything in the world, or even to imagine. Well then, my boy, when I came to Maro-Plessis for the first time, all the three-brained beings of that country were followers of the religion, based upon the ingenious doctrine I have just been telling you about, and this religion was then in full bloom. The inventor of this ingenious doctrine, the wise king Konnichin, had undergone the sacred rasguarno long before this, that is to say, he had died many years earlier. But his invention, owing as always to the strangeness of the psyche of your favorites, had taken such a strong hold that not a single being in the whole country of Maro-Plessis doubted the truth of its very original tenets. From the day of my arrival in the city of Gob, I began as usual visiting the Kaltaini, by this time known as Chaikanas. It must be noted that although the custom of sacrificial offerings was also flourishing at that period in Maro-Plessis, it was not being practiced on so large a scale as it had been in Tikli-Amish. I set about looking for a suitable being in order to make friends with him, as I had done in the city of Kurkalai. And indeed I soon found such a friend, but this time he was not a priest by profession. My new friend turned out to be the proprietor of a large chaikana, and although I came to be on very good terms with him, as they say there, I never had that strange feeling of kinship toward him that had arisen in my essence toward the priest Abdil. I existed for a whole month in the city of Gob, without reaching any decision or undertaking anything practical, for my aim. Accompanied by Ahun, I simply wandered about the city, visiting different chaikanas, including the one that belonged to my new friend. During this time, I became familiar with the manners and customs of this second group, and also with the fine points of their religion. And by the end of the month, I reached the decision to attain my aim, once again, through their religion. After serious pondering, I resolved to add something to the religious doctrine already existing there, and I counted on being able, like the wise King Konnichin, to spread this addition of mine effectively among the beings of that country. What I added was the notion that those spirits who, as was said in that great religion, walk among us wearing caps of invisibility, and watch our deeds and thoughts, are none other than the beings of other forms existing among us. It is just they who watch us and report everything to our Mr. God. But we men not only fail to pay them due honor and respect, but even destroy their existence, both for our food and for sacrificial offerings. In my explanations, I particularly emphasize that not only should we cease destroying the existence of the beings of other forms in honor of Mr. God, but what is more, we should try to win their favor and beseech them, at least not to report to Mr. God all those little evil acts that we commit involuntarily. And I began to spread this addition of mine by every possible means, of course very cautiously. To start with, I did so through my new friend, the proprietor of the chaikana. I must tell you that his chaikana was one of the largest in the whole city of Gob, and was famous for its reddish liquid, of which the beings of the planet Earth are very fond. So it was always filled with customers and was open day and night. It had become a meeting place not only for the inhabitants of the city itself, but also for visitors from the whole of Mara Plessis. I soon became quite expert at converting all these customers, some individually, others by speaking to them in groups. My new friend, the proprietor of the chaikana, believed so firmly in my invention that he was beside himself with remorse. He was in constant distress and bitterly repented his former contemptuous attitude toward the beings of other forms and his treatment of them. Becoming day by day a more fervent advocate of my invention, he not only helped to spread it in his chaikana, but began of his own accord to visit other chaikanas in the city of Gob to proclaim the truth that so agitated him. He held forth in the public markets and even went several times to the outskirts of the city to visit holy places, of which there were many at that period, established in honor or in memory of somebody or something. It is interesting to remark here that on the planet Earth, the stories that give rise to the establishment of holy places usually come from certain terrestrial beings called humbugs. This disease of humbugging or lying is very widespread there. On the planet Earth, people lie both consciously and unconsciously, and they lie consciously when there is some personal material advantage to be gained, and unconsciously when they fall ill of the disease known as hysteria. Besides the proprietor of the chaikana, there were a number of other beings of the city of Gob who began unconsciously to help me, as they also had become ardent supporters of my invention, and soon all the beings of that second Asiatic group were eagerly spreading this invention of mine and persuading each other that it was an indubitable truth that had suddenly been revealed to them. The result of it all was that in the country of Mara Plessis, not only did sacrificial offerings diminish, but the beings of other forms even began to be treated with unprecedented attention. Such comical scenes were enacted there that although I myself was the author of the invention, I found it difficult to refrain from laughter. We witnessed, for instance, farces such as these. A highly respectable and wealthy merchant would be riding to his shop one morning on his donkey. On the way, a motley crowd of beings would pull him off his donkey and maul him within an inch of his life for having dared to sit on it. Then, bowing low before it, the crowd would escort the donkey wherever it chose to go. Or, what is called a woodcutter would be hauling a load of wood from the forest to market with his oxen. He too would be dragged from his cart and beaten, and then the crowd would very gently unyoke the oxen and escort them ceremoniously wherever they wanted to go. And if all this had happened in a part of the city where the cart might hold up traffic, the crowd would haul it to the market themselves and leave it there to its fate. This invention of mine soon led to the appearance of quite new customs in the city of Gob. For instance, that of placing troughs in the public squares and at all the street crossings, where every morning the residents could leave their choicest morsels of food for dogs and other stray beings. And also the custom of going at sunrise to the Sea of Beneficence, to throw in all kinds of food for the beings called fish. But the most peculiar of all was the custom of paying attention to the voices of one-brained and two-brained beings of various forms. As soon as your favorites heard the voice of a being of any other form, they would begin praising the name of their God and invoking his blessing. It might be the crowing of a cock, the barking of a dog, the meowing of a cat, the squealing of an ape. No matter what, it would always arouse them. It is interesting to remark here that on these occasions, for some reason or other, they would raise their heads and look upward, even though, according to the teaching of their religion, their God and his assistants were supposed to exist on the same level as themselves, and not where they directed their eyes in prayers. It was extremely interesting to watch their faces at these moments. "Pardon me, your right reverence," interrupted Beelzebub's devoted old servant Ahun, who had been listening to these tales with the greatest interest. "Do you remember, your right reverence, how often in that city of Gob we ourselves had to flop down in the street at the cries of beings of different forms?" "Indeed, I do remember, dear Ahun," replied Beelzebub. "How could I ever forget such comical impressions?" "The fact is," he continued, turning to Hussein again, "the three-brained beings of the planet Earth are inconceivably proud and touchy. If someone does not share their views, or agree to do as they do, or criticizes their manifestations, they are very offended, and their indignation knows no bounds. And if one of them should happen to have some power, he would order anyone rash enough to criticize his conduct, or to behave differently from himself, to be shut up in the sort of place usually crawling with rats and lice. And if the offended one should be physically stronger, and no one were looking, at least no important power-possessing being with whom he happened to be on bad terms, he would simply give the offender a good thrashing, as the Russian Sidor once thrashed his favorite goat. Well, knowing this aspect of their strange psyche, I had no desire to offend them and incur their wrath. Furthermore, as I was profoundly aware that to outrage anybody's religious feeling is contrary to all morality, I tried, when existing among them, always to do as they did, so as not to be conspicuous and draw attention to myself. Here it will do no harm to point out that, owing to the abnormal conditions of ordinary existence there, the only beings of that strange planet, especially during recent centuries, who became notable, and are therefore honored by the rest, are those who manifest themselves somehow or other more absurdly than the majority, and the more absurd their manifestations, the more stupid, mean, and insolent the tricks they play, the more celebrated they became, and the greater is the number of beings on their own continent, or even on other continents, who know them personally, or at least by name. On the other hand, an honest being who does not behave absurdly has no chance at all of becoming famous, or even of being noticed, however kind and sensible he may be. So, my boy, when our Ahun mischievously reminded me of our ludicrous situation, I was speaking of the custom of attaching significance to the voices of beings of various forms, and particularly to the voice of donkeys, of which, for some reason or other, there were a great many in the city of Gob. On that planet, the beings of other forms make their voices heard, each at a definite time. For instance, the cock crows just before dawn, an ape cries in the morning when it is hungry, and so on. But donkeys bray whenever it enters their heads to do so, and in consequence, you may hear the voice of that silly being at any hour of the day or night. Well then, it became customary in the city of Gob that whenever the sound of a donkey's bray was heard, everyone immediately had to flop down and offer up prayers to their god and their revered idols. I must add that nature has given the donkey a very loud voice, and its braying can be heard a long way off. So as we walked along the streets of the city and saw the citizens flopping down at the braying of every donkey, we had to flop down likewise, so as not to appear different from the others. And it was this ridiculous custom, I see now, that tickled old Ahun so much. Did you notice, dear Hassan, with what venomous satisfaction our old friend reminded me, after so many centuries, of my comical situation at that time? Having said this, Beelzebub, with a smile, went on with his tale. Needless to say, in this second center of culture on the continent of Ashark, the destruction of beings of other forms for sacrificial offerings entirely ceased, and if isolated instances did occur, the other beings of that group settled accounts with the offenders without compunction. Having thus become convinced that I had succeeded so easily in uprooting for a long time to come the custom of sacrificial offerings among the second group of beings on the continent of Ashark, I decided to leave. But I had it in my mind, in any event, to visit other large centers inhabited by the beings of Paraplesi, and I chose for this purpose the region of the river called Nariachi. Soon after making this decision, I sailed with Ahun to the mouth of that river and began to travel up it against the current. At each of the large centers we came to, I was able to verify that there had already passed from the beings of the city of Gulb to the beings of these places the same new customs and notions concerning the destruction of the existence of beings of other forms for sacrificial offerings. We finally arrived at a small town called Arguenya, which in those days was considered the most remote part of the country of Maro-Plessis. It was inhabited by a fair number of beings of this second Asiatic group, who were engaged chiefly in extracting from nature what is called turquoise. In the small town of Arguenya, in accordance with my usual procedure, I began to visit various chaikanas, pursuing there, as always, the fulfillment of my principal aim.